Imagine picking up a children's book at your local store. The cover shows a little boy looking up at the sky, where his father watches over him with angel wings. The title reads, "Are You With Me?" The author is a young Utah mother named Corey Richens, who wrote it, she said, to help her 3 sons cope with the sudden death of their father. In interviews, she appeared on local television, soft-spoken and tearful, a picture of devoted motherhood in the middle of devastating loss. She told one reporter that writing the book brought a little peace to her and her boys. Less than a year after that book was published, a Summit County jury found Corey Richens guilty of murdering her husband Eric with a lethal dose of fentanyl. The woman who wrote a grief book for children had, according to prosecutors, created the very grief she was writing about. This is one of the most chilling true crime stories in recent memory, not just because of what happened, but because of the audacity of what came after. Let's go back to the beginning. Corey and Eric Richens married in June of 2013 in the backyard of their Utah home near Park City. They were Eric's second marriage, and on the day they wed, they signed a prenuptial agreement establishing that they would not have rights to each other's property, with one critical exception: if Eric died while the two were still lawfully married. That one line would become the center of everything. Eric was a hard-working, successful man. He owned a masonry business and was worth in the neighborhood of $5 million. Corey, by contrast, was struggling. She had launched a real estate business in 2019, but it was failing fast. She secretly took out a home equity loan for $250,000 from the family home without Eric knowing. When he discovered the loan at the bank in 2020, a handwriting expert would later determine there was a high probability she had forged his signature. In total, she had accumulated roughly $3.1 million in debt. Here is the trap she found herself in. Because of the prenup, if she left Eric, she would walk away with almost nothing. But if he died while they were still married, she stood to inherit his estate. So she stayed and allegedly started planning. In January of 2022, she took out multiple life insurance policies on Eric, again allegedly forging his signature. They were worth around $2 million, and Eric had no idea they existed. Meanwhile, she had rekindled a relationship with her ex-boyfriend, a man named Robert Josh Grossman. Prosecutors allege she planned to collect Eric's estate and then continue her relationship with Grossman after her husband's death. According to testimony at trial, she sent Grossman a text just 2 weeks before Eric died, promising him that life was going to be different, that things would change by Friday. On that Friday, Eric Richens was dead. But the night of March 4th, 2022 was not the first attempt. Prosecutors said Corey had also tried to poison Eric on Valentine's Day, weeks earlier, in what would become a separate charge of attempted aggravated murder. That first try apparently failed, so she tried again. She purchased more fentanyl and, on the night of his death, made Eric a vodka cocktail spiked with 5 times the lethal dose of the drug. He went to sleep and never woke up. The prosecution's star witness was a house cleaner named Carmen Lauber, who testified that Corey had asked her for drugs several times in early 2022. When investigators later asked Corey what had happened, she offered an explanation that would come back to haunt her. She claimed her husband had eaten a fentanyl-laced gummy on his own. Eric Richens was 39 years old. He had no prior history of drug use. Now here is where the story takes a turn that is almost impossible to fully comprehend. In the weeks and months that followed Eric's death, Corey did not grieve quietly. She began publicly positioning herself as a devoted widow. She authored a children's book titled "Are You With Me?", featuring a father with angel wings watching over his young son, a A book she wrote, she said, to help her children process losing their father. In promotional interviews, she said she had written it together with her kids, the oldest of whom was 10, and that the process had brought a little peace to her and her boys. She was interviewed on local television. She promoted the book. She presented herself as a mother navigating grief with grace and purpose. And all of this was happening while investigators were quietly closing in. Prosecutors painted her as an intensely ambitious but deeply incompetent businesswoman who projected affluence even as she fell further into debt. There was also a detail that Eric had apparently discovered on his own. He had quietly cut Corey out of his will years earlier after learning that some of the debt she had accumulated had been racked up in his name. Corey, prosecutors argued, did not know this. She killed him believing she would collect everything, and she was wrong. In May 2023, just weeks after giving a television interview about her children's book, Corey Richens was arrested. She maintained her innocence and was held at the Summit County Jail from that point forward. The trial began in February 2026 and lasted 3 weeks. Prosecutors called more than 40 witnesses to build their case, relying largely on circumstantial evidence since no witness could directly testify to seeing Corey put the drugs into Eric's drink. The defense leaned hard on that gap. Defense attorney Wendy Lewis argued repeatedly that the prosecution could not prove how the drugs entered Eric Richens' body. She told the jury that if you looked at the same facts from a different angle, you saw not a killer, but a widow. The jury did not see it that way. After just 3 hours of deliberations, the 8-person jury returned a unanimous guilty verdict on all 5 charges. They convicted Corey of first-degree aggravated murder, attempted aggravated murder, forgery, and 2 counts of insurance fraud. Corey, wearing a floral blouse, bowed her head as the judge read the verdict aloud. The jury unanimously agreed that the murder had been committed for financial gain and by means of a substance administered in a lethal quantity. The money, jurors later said, was paramount in their minds. Eric's family wept in the courtroom as the verdict was read. They expressed relief, saying they could now focus on honoring his memory and supporting his 3 sons. Those 3 boys, the same ones whose faces appeared in news coverage, whose grief inspired the book that became evidence of their mother's motive, are now left without either parent in the home. Sentencing is scheduled for May 13, 2026, what would have been Eric Richens' 44th birthday. Corey faces 25 years to life in prison without the possibility of parole. What makes this case so difficult to look away from is not just the crime itself, it is the performance that followed it. The grief book, the soft-spoken interviews, the image of the devoted widow mother. Every element of that public persona, prosecutors argued, was a calculated act of self-preservation. She had written a book about a father watching over his children from heaven, and she had put him there. There is a detail that lingers. The book's cover, that image of a little boy looking up at the sky, reaching toward a father with angel wings, was meant to comfort children facing loss. But now that image carries a different weight entirely. Because the loss those children were facing, according to a jury of 8 people who deliberated for 3 hours, was not an accident. It was not a tragedy. It was a plan. One juror, speaking publicly after the verdict, described how the panel went around the table one by one, sharing their thoughts on the evidence before reaching their decision. They did not need long. Corey Richens will be sentenced this spring, and somewhere in Utah, 3 boys are growing up without their father, the one their mother wrote about in a book, the one she claimed to be grieving, the one the jury says she killed.